I took the job at Keller Brandt Pharmaceuticals because I needed health insurance. That's the honest answer. Not because I was fascinated by security work. Not because I had some calling to sit in a dim room watching feeds from hallways where nothing happened. I was 34, I'd been freelancing IT support for 3 years, my Cobra had lapsed, and I needed a root canal I couldn't afford. The benefits at Keller Brandt kicked in after 60 days. Why? Right. One of self and something over Maple 19-eyed in Keller Brandt Maple inside. That's the high. The posting said, Facility Monitor Technician Night Shift, and the pay was $23 an hour, which felt generous for what amounted to watching screens. The building was in an office park outside of Braddock, Pennsylvania, about 20 minutes from Pittsburgh proper. It didn't look like much from the outside. 5 stories of tinted glass and beige concrete, the kind of building you'd drive past 10,000 times and never form a memory of. The company made, or maybe tested, I was never entirely clear, compounds for psychiatric medications. Antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, that sort of thing. The research happened somewhere else. This location was mostly administrative, data storage, and what they called controlled environment archiving, which I eventually understood to mean the sub-basement levels where they kept physical samples and documentation under specific temperature and humidity conditions. My first week was training with a guy named Dale Messer, who'd been there 11 years. Inside Dale was 50-something, soft-spoken, had a thick gray mustache, and wore the same navy blue fleece every shift. I myself as 9 passons, mon / Oblay passons and Rousselve were... Then suddenly D, wise wheeze, ruse as kide, etc. Aston spied that He showed me the monitoring station on the 2nd floor, a room about the size of a large walk-in closet with 3 desks arranged in an L shape, each desk holding 2 monitors. 12 screens total, though only 10 were active. Dale explained the feeds cycled automatically every 40 seconds unless you pinned one, and that the software logged motion events that we were supposed to review at the top of each hour. Mostly you're just here in case something trips, Dale said. Power issues, humidity alarms, someone badges in after hours who shouldn't. It's boring, which is the point. The facility had 4 levels below ground. Asked Kai, but knew Jime and Miss Bakte, citing Caffing Wayne. Sub-A through Sub-D. Sub-AI was general storage office supplies, old furniture, Christmas decorations for the lobby. Sub-AI was general storage. Was that... Sub-AI was general storage office. Kelleres the tend and contrared the tentrid dows, with sun then died win, which ren that dows in trine. Then died in tentrid that dows and died in censure. That's died in. Sub-B was the controlled environment floor. Was as... Sub-C housed mechanical and electrical infrastructure. When Yao times all way... What? I fall the sard I zard why... Sub-D, Dale told me, was decommissioned. Itin Dao to Cizel V. Wow. Wow. was... Nye. Sub D, Dale told me, was...
What does that mean?
I asked. Means there's nothing down there. They cleared it out years ago, before my time. The elevator doesn't even stop there anymore. Each sub-level had its own camera array. Sub A had 4 cameras. Sub B had 6. Sub C had 3. Dale said Sub D used to have cameras too, but the feeds had been disconnected long before he started. The 6 cameras on Sub B were labeled in the system as BA Alpha through B Foxtrot. Alphabetical. Alpha covered the elevator vestibule. Bravo watched the main corridor heading east. My... Why else? Why? Prantikower Brant Pharmaceutical. Charlie was positioned at the junction where the corridor split north and south. Delta covered the south hallway leading to the sample storage rooms. Echo was mounted at the far end of the north hallway near the climate control units. Foxtrot was inside the primary archive room itself, a large, temperature-regulated space where metal shelving units held boxes of labeled samples and binders of documentation going back decades. I learned the layout because Dale quizzed me on it. He said the overnight shift was just me alone from midnight to 8, and I needed to know exactly what I was looking at if something tripped. He wasn't unkind about it. Just methodical in the way people get when they've done something so long it's become liturgical. My first solo shift was on a Wednesday in November. It was uneventful. The building was empty by 7 p.m. most nights. The cleaning crew came between 8 and 10, and after that, it was just me. The parking lot would be dark, except for the sodium lights. The building hummed in that low-frequency way large structures do when the HVAC is cycling. I checked the motion logs every hour. I read a book. I ate a sandwich from the vending machine on the first floor. At 3 a.m., I walked the perimeter of the second floor just to stretch my legs, then came back and watched the feeds rotate through their cycles until my relief, a woman named Sandra, arrived at 8. For the first 3 weeks, nothing happened that was worth remembering. The feeds showed empty hallways in that blue-gray night vision cast. Sometimes a motion event would log because of the HVAC kicking the dust around near a vent, or because the fluorescent lights on Sub-C would flicker and the software would interpret the change in light level as movement. Dale had warned me about that. But one day... The system's sensitive. You'll get false positives. Just note them, clear them, move on. It was during my 4th week, the first night of December, when I noticed B Alpha go dark. Or Bacco... Dak. It by Alpha go dark. I Afkaz... Backaz... Vacaz... That... Dak... That as... I didn't notice it immediately. The feed cycle, and I wasn't watching Sub B specifically. But at my 1 a.m. log review, the system showed a camera status alert. Bazalpha signal lost 12:47 a.m. The feed was just black. Not static. Not a frozen image. Just a flat, even black, like the camera was still powered but couldn't see anything. I followed the protocol Dale had shown me. I tried a remote reboot through the software. The camera cycled, I could see the status indicator blink from offline to connecting back to offline. Nothing came back. I logged the issue in the maintenance request system, categorized it as a hardware malfunction and noted the timestamp. That was it. That was the whole event. A camera died. They die all the time. Dale had told me that 2 cameras on Sub AA had been replaced the previous spring because of condensation damage. The next morning I mentioned it to Sandra during the handoff. She shrugged and said she'd pass it to facilities. I went home, slept, came back that night. Bay Alpha was still down. No one had been to fix it. The request was marked acknowledged in the system but not assigned to anyone. I didn't think much of it. Maintenance tickets in a corporate environment can sit for days, especially for non-critical issues. Sub B was secure badge access only, climate-controlled, no public-facing areas. A dead camera in a hallway no one walked at night wasn't urgent. 4 days later, on a Friday night, B Bravo went down. I noticed it at 2 a.m. review. Signal loss at 1:33 a.m. Same presentation, flat black screen, camera cycling but not reconnecting on remote reboot. I logged it the same way. 2 cameras on the same floor now. It registered with me, but only in the way a minor inconvenience does. A wiring issue, maybe? Some junction box on Sub B losing connection. It would explain both cameras failing within a week. I wrote it up and mentioned it to Sandra again. She said he'd escalate it. She seemed slightly more attentive this time, which I attributed to the fact that losing 2 cameras on a secured floor was the kind of thing that could show up in a compliance audit. The following Tuesday, B Charlie went dark. This time I was actually watching the feed when it happened. I'd pinned the Sub B rotation because some part of me, some pattern recognition instinct I wasn't fully conscious of yet, had been keeping half an eye on it. At 2:11 a.m., the Charlie feed the junction camera, the one that showed where the corridor split, simply went black. One frame it showed the empty hallway with its polished floor and institutional ceiling tiles and the 2 directional signs on the wall, and the next frame it showed nothing. Like a light switch. Like closing your eyes. I sat forward in my chair and watched the black screen for a long time. Then I checked the other Sub B feeds. Delta, Echo, and Foxtrot were still active. Still showing their empty hallways in the archive room, everything still and gray-blue in the night vision. I called the facility's emergency number, which rang to a voicemail. I sent an email to my supervisor, a man named Greg Torrance, whom I'd met exactly once during my onboarding. I used the subject line, 3rd Sub B camera failure, possible infrastructure issue. I kept the email professional and brief. Then I sat in my chair and thought, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie. In order. I want to be clear about something. I'm not a superstitious person. I don't believe in ghosts or curses or whatever else. And the alphabetical progression, it could easily be explained by the physical layout. The cameras were installed in sequence, meaning their wiring probably ran in sequence too. If there was a failing junction box or a corroding cable trunk, it would make sense that the cameras closest to the origin point of the wiring would fail first, and the failure would propagate outward along the line. That's what I told myself. That's what made sense. But there was something else bothering me. Something I couldn't quite articulate at first. It took me another day of thinking about it before I realized what it was. The timing wasn't consistent with a progressive hardware failure. Alpha went down on a Monday, Bravo on Friday, Charlie on Tuesday. The intervals were 4 days, then 4 days. Not gradual degradation, discrete events, separated by consistent gaps. I didn't mention the alphabetical thing or the timing to anyone. It felt foolish. Like the kind of pattern matching that conspiracy theorists do, finding significance in noise. And I was new. I'd been there less than 2 months. I didn't want to be the overnight guy who saw things that weren't there. Greg Torrance responded to my email the next day with a single line. We. Maintenance has been notified. Please continue logging per standard protocol. No indication that anyone found it unusual. No acknowledgement of the pattern, just procedure. No acknowledgement of the pattern. I went about my shifts. I checked the remaining 3 cameras on Sub B more frequently than I should have. No acknowledgement of the pattern. I found myself calculating. If the pattern held 4-day intervals, alphabetical order, then Delta would go down on Saturday. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. My shift started at midnight. I pinned the Delta feed immediately. The south hallway, leading to the sample rooms. Fluorescent lit from the emergency lighting, which stayed on around the clock down there. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. The floor gleamed faint. The hallway was empty, as it always was. Kana. At 1:52 a.m., the feed went black. I was looking directly at it. And I can tell you that in the frame before it went dark, there was nothing in that hallway. No figure, no shadow, no visible interference. Just the hallway, and then nothing. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching my hand. I remember that specifically, the way my fingertips felt against the keyboard when I went to log it. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. I did a remote reboot attempt, failure, maintenance ticket, timestamp. My hands were steady, but they were cold, and the room felt smaller than it usually did. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. 4 cameras now. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. At 4-day in, all going dark during my shift, in the early hours of the morning. I had 2 data points left. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. Echo was due Wednesday. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. Foxtrot would follow. I need to explain something about what Sub B looked like on the remaining feeds. Echo showed the north hallway, a long stretch of corridor ending at the climate control units, large beige boxes with ventilation grills and digital readouts. The hallway had 3 doors on the left side, all of them access restricted, all of them closed. Foxtrot showed the archive room interior, rows of metal shelving about 7 feet tall, spaced evenly, with aisle markers on the floor. The room was always well lit because of the archival preservation requirements. We. It was the only camera on Sub B that wasn't shooting in night vision because the lights in that room never turned off. With 4 cameras down, these 2 were my only visibility into a significant portion of the floor. And the floor was large. I'd seen the blueprints on the wall near Dale's desk. Sub B covered roughly the same footprint as the building above it. Thousands of square feet of corridor and storage space, all of it now dark to me except for 1 hallway and 1 room. On Monday, 2 days before Echo was due, if my prediction held, I came in for my shift and found a note from Sandra on the desk. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. It said, FYI, facilities came down today to check cameras. Found nothing wrong with hardware. Going to replace cable runs next week. Found nothing wrong with the hardware. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. I read that twice. Then I folded the note and put it in my pocket, which was a strange thing to do. I don't know why I didn't just leave it on the desk. They found nothing wrong with the hardware. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. The cameras were fine. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. The cable runs were fine. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. They just weren't transmitting. Or something was preventing them from transmitting. Or something was. I stopped that line of thinking. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. I made myself stop. That night, I pulled up the maintenance ticket history for Sub B. It required supervisor credentials to access the full log, and I didn't have those, but I could see the top-level status of each ticket. All 4 of my reports were marked "Inspected, no fault found, pending further review." The phrase "no fault found" appeared on each one like a stamp. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching, like a diagnosis of nothing. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. Wednesday came. I was in the chair by 11:45 p.m., 15 minutes before my shift officially started. Sandra looked at me oddly when I walked in early, but didn't say anything. She'd been quiet during our handoffs lately. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. Short, no acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. Less eye contact. I didn't know if that meant anything or if I was reading into it. After she left, I sat alone in the monitoring room and pinned the echo feed. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. The north hallway. The climate control units at the far end. The 3 closed doors on the left. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. I decided to do something I hadn't done before. At 12:30, I picked up the desk phone and called the facility's emergency line. Someone answered, this time a man with a flat, tired voice. "This is Keller Brandt Braddock Monitoring Station," I said. "I'm the overnight tech. I've been logging camera failures on Sub B over the past several weeks. I wanted to flag that I'm expecting another failure tonight and ask if there's any way to get someone down there to check in real time." No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. There was a pause. Then the man said, "Expecting a failure? There's been a pattern. They've been going sequentially. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. I'll make a note. Is there an active issue right now? No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. We'll follow up during business hours. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I sat there with the receiver in my hand for a moment, feeling foolish. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. Like I was predicting the weather. Like I was trying to sound important. I put the phone down and went back to watching Echo. At 1:08 a.m., the screen went dark. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. Instantaneous. No flicker. No static. No gradual fade. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. Just one frame of hallway, the next frame of black. I sat very still for a long time after that. I could hear my own breathing in the quiet room. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. The hum of the building, the faint click of the software cycling through the other feeds. I looked at the remaining active screen Foxtrot. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. The archive room. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. The shelving units. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. The clean floor. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. This was the last camera on Sub B. And if the pattern held, it would go dark on Sunday. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. I logged Echo's failure. I did it mechanically. The way you do something you've rehearsed too many times. And then I did something that surprised me. I went downstairs. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. I didn't have badge access to Sub B during overnight hours. But I went to the elevator on the first floor, and I stood in front of it, and I looked at the panel. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for the upper floors. And then below the line. SA, SB, SC. No, SD Dale had said the elevator was reprogrammed when they decommissioned that level. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. I pressed SB. The badge reader next to the button blinked red. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. Access restricted. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. I knew it would. I wasn't trying to go down. I just wanted to... I don't know. Confirm that the floor was real. That there was a physical place beneath me that corresponded to those black screens. No acknowledgement of the pattern. Saturday came. I was watching. I went back upstairs. The next morning, during the handoff, I asked Sandra something I probably shouldn't have. Have you ever been down to Sub B? She was gathering her things, a paperback novel, a thermos, her badge lanyard. She paused with the thermos in her hand. Rah! In he save. Rah! Once. During orientation, they took us through. That was God, 7 years ago. What's it like? She shrugged, but something in her face tightened. It's a basement. Hallways, shelves, cold. Why? The cameras. Yeah. She put the thermos in her bag. I saw your tickets. I'm sure they'll get it sorted. They said there's nothing wrong with the hardware. Sandra looked at me for a moment. Not suspiciously, exactly. More like she was trying to decide whether to say something. Then she zipped her bag and said, I've learned not to worry about things I can't see. I turned that sentence over in my mind for the rest of the day. It had sounded rehearsed. Not like advice, like a mantra. Something she told herself. Thursday and Friday passed without incident. I watched the Foxtrot feed obsessively. The archive room. The rows of shelving. The occasional shimmer of heat distortion near the climate vents in the ceiling. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. The boxes sat in their rows, their white labels facing outward, too small to read on camera. The floor tiles light gray, institutional, perfectly square, stretched from wall to wall, without interruption. But here's what started bothering me, and I know how this sounds. The room looked not wrong exactly, not rearranged, but different in the way a room looks different when you've been staring at a photograph of it for too long and your brain starts questioning whether you're remembering it correctly or seeing it freshly each time. I couldn't point to a single specific change. The shelving was in the same place. The boxes appeared to be in the same order. The light was the same even, clinical white. But something about the space felt compressed. Like the proportions had shifted by some imperceptible margin. Like the walls were slightly closer together, or the ceiling slightly lower, or the shelves slightly deeper. I tried to dismiss it as I strained. As the natural distortion of staring at a fixed image on a monitor for hours at a time. That explanation made sense, and I accepted it. Mostly. On Friday evening before my shift, I went to the public library and used their computer to look up Kellerbrandt Pharmaceuticals. I don't know what I expected to find. Some scandal, some history, some explanation that would click everything into place. What I found was utterly mundane. A corporate website with stock photos of lab workers smiling. Press releases about clinical trials for a new antidepressant formulation. A LinkedIn page with a few hundred employees. An address in Delaware for the parent company. Nothing about the Braddock facility specifically, beyond a brief mention in a real estate article from 2008 about the office park's development. I also searched for Keller Brandt Sub B and Keller Brandt Sublevel and Keller Brandt Basement and found nothing. I searched for the building's address combined with words like incident and accident and investigation. Nothing. No news. No reports. Just a pharmaceutical company with a regional office in an unremarkable building in an unremarkable part of western Pennsylvania. I didn't know what I wanted to find, and I found nothing, and somehow that was worse. Saturday night. My shift before Foxtrot was due to go dark. I arrived at 11:45 again. Whoa! Back. Sandra was still there, reading her paperback. She looked up when I came in. Early again, she said. Can't sleep. It was true. I hadn't been sleeping well. Not nightmares. Just a persistent, low-grade wakefulness that sat behind my eyes even when they were closed. Sandra stood up and started packing her things. Then she stopped and said, without looking at me, I talked to Greg today. About the cameras? He said they're handling it. He said not to worry about it. He said... She paused. He said the monitoring role for Sub B might be temporarily removed from our rotation until the issue is resolved. What does that mean? It means we stop watching it, the system stops cycling to those feeds, we just don't monitor that floor. But Foxtrot is still active. There's still one camera up. Sandra pulled her bag over her shoulder. I'm just telling you what he said. She met my eyes for a brief moment. But... Good night, Marcus. She left. I heard her footsteps in the hallway, the elevator chime, and then silence. I sat down and pinned Foxtrot. The archive room. The shelves. The boxes. The gray floor. I watched it for hours. I didn't check the other floors. I didn't walk the perimeter. I didn't eat. I just watched. And the room didn't change. Nothing moved. The time passed in that strange, elongated way it passes when you're intensely focused on stillness, when you're waiting for something to happen and nothing does, and the waiting itself becomes a kind of event. At around 4 a.m, something occurred to me. A small thought, but once I had it, I couldn't let it go. The pattern was every 4 days. My cat. Alpha on Monday. Bravo on Friday. Charlie on Tuesday. Delta on Saturday. Echo on Wednesday. That put Foxtrot on Sunday, which was tonight, technically. My shift ran from midnight Saturday into Sunday morning. If the pattern held, Foxtrot would go dark before 8 a.m., but the cameras had all failed between 12:47 and 2:11 a.m. That was the window. I was already past it. It was after 4. Foxtrot was still on. Had the pattern broken? Had I been wrong? I felt a strange mixture of relief and something else, something almost like disappointment, which I recognized as irrational and unhealthy. I didn't want the camera to go dark. Wee. I didn't. But I'd been so certain about the pattern that its failure felt like losing my footing on a step I thought was there. I watched Foxtrot until Sandra arrived at 8. The camera stayed on. The archive room sat there in its permanent light, unchanged, unmoving. I handed off to Sandra without mentioning any of it. I went home. I slept fitfully for 4 hours, then lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the traffic outside my apartment, thinking about nothing and everything. Sunday night. I came in at midnight. Sandra had left a note. Foxtrot still active, nothing to report. See you Monday. I sat down. I pinned Foxtrot, and I noticed something immediately. One of the boxes on the third shelf from the bottom, second row from the left, was turned around. Its label faced the wall instead of the aisle. I stared at it for a long time. Then I looked at the rest of the shelving. Everything else appeared normal. Just that one box reversed. And I genuinely couldn't be certain whether it had been that way before. I'd spent hours staring at this feed, but had I been looking at individual box orientations? Had I ever actually inventoried the positions of every item on every shelf? Number. Of course not. It could have been like that for weeks and I wouldn't have noticed. But I noticed it now. And once I noticed it, I couldn't stop looking at it. That one box facing the wrong way, like a word misspelled in a sentence you've read 100 times. I pulled out a notebook, just a cheap spiral-bound thing I kept for shift notes, and I drew a rough grid of the shelving layout as best I could from the camera angle. I marked the position of the reversed box. I noted the time. 12:15 a.m. I told myself I was being thorough. I told myself I was being professional. I did not tell myself the truth, which was that I was afraid. An hour later, I checked again. The box was back. Label facing out, like everything else. I looked at my notebook. I looked at the screen. I looked at my notebook again. The position I'd marked third shelf from the bottom, second row from the left, now showed a box with its label facing outward, identical to all the others. I did not log this. I did not write a maintenance ticket. I did not call the facility's emergency line. I sat in my chair and I pressed my palms flat against the desk and I focused on the feeling of the laminate surface under my hands until my breathing was even. There were explanations. There are always explanations. The most obvious. I was mistaken. I was tired. I'd been staring at screens for hours. I'd been obsessing over a camera issue for weeks, and my brain had manufactured a detail that wasn't there. Pareidolia, but for order instead of faces. I'd been looking so hard for something wrong that I'd seen something wrong that didn't exist. That was the explanation. And I accepted it. Mostly. The next few shifts were quiet. Foxtrot stayed on. The archive room remained static. I forced myself to check the other floors, to do the perimeter walks, to eat my meals, to read during the slow hours. I was trying to perform normalcy for myself, to prove that I was still professional, still rational, still the kind of person who does not lose perspective over a series of camera malfunctions. But I was also watching Foxtrot. Always watching Foxtrot. And I started noticing or imagining I could never be sure small inconsistencies. A box that seemed slightly more forward on its shelf than the previous night. A shadow under one of the shelving units that appeared slightly larger or smaller depending on when I looked. The digital readout on the climate monitor mounted on the far wall, it displayed temperature and humidity, but the numbers were too small to read clearly on camera. Sometimes I thought the digits had changed between checks, and sometimes I was sure they hadn't. But I couldn't be sure of my sureness, if that makes sense. My confidence in my own observations had eroded. About 10 days after the last camera failure, after Echo went dark and the pattern should have taken Foxtrot but didn't, I was sitting at the monitoring station at approximately 2:30 in the morning when I saw something on the Foxtrot feed that I cannot explain away as fatigue or imagination or pattern-seeking behavior. In the archive room, between the second and third rows of shelving, at the far end of an aisle visible only because of the specific angle of the camera, which looked down from a high corner and could see just a narrow slice of the aisle floors between the shelf rows, there was a shape on the floor that had not been there before. It was dark. Not a shadow darker than a shadow, and a room with even overhead lighting that produced almost no shadows at all. It was irregular in form, roughly the size of a crumpled jacket or a small bag. It was on the floor between the shelves, near the far wall. I leaned forward until my face was inches from the screen. The shape didn't move. It had no discernible features. It was simply there, a dark mass in a place where nothing had been. I sat there watching it for 40 minutes. It didn't move. It didn't change shape. It was just present, like it had always been present, like the room had grown it from its own floor. At 3:14 a.m. I checked the clock. I remember checking it deliberately. The Foxtrot feed went to black, Massauzo and dot plaque. A 7/10 down dot 10 and men. I 7 dowzo, whoa. Not a slow fade. Not a transition. The same instantaneous drop I'd seen 5 times before. One frame of the archive room with its shelves and its clean floor and its even light and that dark shape in the aisle. And the next frame, nothing. Flat black. All 6 cameras on Sub B were now dark. I logged it. I submitted the maintenance ticket. I sat in the monitoring room with its remaining feeds cycling through Sub A and Sub C and the upper floors, showing me nothing but empty offices and storage rooms and the mechanical guts of the building, and I thought about what I'd seen. The dark shape on the floor. I could still see it in my mind. I tried to convince myself it was a box that had fallen from a shelf, or a piece of equipment left behind by a maintenance worker. These were reasonable explanations. They were easy to believe. I almost believed them. But there had been something about the way it sat on the floor, the way it occupied space. It wasn't lying on the tiles. It was more like the tiles had given way to it. Like the floor had a hole in it that happened to be shaped like a crumpled thing. I don't know how to describe it better than that. It looked like an absence, with dimension. And I know that doesn't make logical sense. The next day, Greg Torrance sent an email to both Sandra and me. The subject line was, Sub B Monitoring Update. The body read, effective immediately, Sub B has been removed from the active monitoring rotation. Facilities will handle surveillance of that level through alternative means. No further action is required from monitoring staff regarding Sub B camera systems. Please direct any questions to your direct supervisor. That was me. Greg was my direct supervisor. It was a strange kind of loop. Any questions I had, I was supposed to direct to the person who just told me to stop asking questions. I replied, understood. Can you clarify what alternative means refers to? He didn't respond. I want to describe what it felt like, working in that monitoring room after Sub B was removed from our rotation. The software simply skipped it now. The feeds cycled through Sub A and Sub C in the upper floors, and the Sub B screens remained blank. Not black like a failed camera, but gray with the text, feed inactive not in rotation, displayed in small white letters. 6 gray screens in the cycle, each one appearing for its 40 seconds of nothing before the system moved on. It should have been a relief. The problem was someone else's now. Whatever was happening on Sub B was a facilities issue, an infrastructure issue, a problem for people with higher clearances and deeper knowledge of the building. I could go back to my normal routine. My boring, safe, uneventful routine of watching empty hallways and checking motion logs. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not in an obsessive, intrusive way, more like a low hum in the back of my mind. A frequency I couldn't tune out. Especially at night, especially in the monitoring room, especially during the quiet hours between 2 and 4 when the building was at its most still and the only sounds were the HVAC and the click of the cycling software and my own careful breathing. I started paying closer attention to the Sub-AA cameras. Not because I expected to see anything, but because Sub-A was directly above Sub-B. Same footprint, roughly the same layout. If I watched the floors of Sub-AA carefully enough, sometimes I could almost imagine I was looking through them. Nows. Sometimes I vas. Down into the hallways below. Down into the dark where the cameras couldn't see anymore. That's not rational. The floors were thick, solid, industrial concrete with rebar and waterproofing. You can't see through concrete. You can't hear through it either, except for the very lowest frequencies, the kind that travel through building structures like waves through water. Which is maybe why, on a Thursday in late December, I noticed a sound. It was so low it was almost more of a feeling than a sound. A vibration in the desk surface. A faint pressure in my ears like the beginning of a yawn that never fully arrives. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. I lifted my hands from the desk, and the feeling was gone. I sat still, waiting for it to come back. But it came back the next night. Same time, roughly 2:20 a.m. The same sub-audible vibration. Slightly longer this time. Maybe... then gone. The third night, it lasted over a minute, and I could hear it just barely, at the very bottom edge of my hearing. One Zen. One's about not die in massed class. A low rhythmic pulse. Not mechanical. Not like the HVAC or the elevator or any building system I recognized. More organic than that. More like, and I hesitate to say this because of how it sounds more like breathing. Very slow. Very deep. Coming from below. I got up from my chair and stood in the middle of the monitoring room. I could feel it through the floor, cacking. My having back one dack. My time. Through the soles of my shoes. A vibration rising up through the building structure, through the concrete and steel from somewhere far below. I walked to the elevator. I stood in front of the panel. The buttons for the sub-levels were there. Well, SA, SB, SC. I didn't press any of them. I just stood there, feeling the vibration in my feet, until it stopped. In January, Dale came by on a Saturday afternoon outside his usual schedule to drop off some paperwork. I was in the monitoring room doing my pre-shift prep. He seemed surprised to see me there early. "Everything good?" he asked, setting the papers on Sandra's desk. "Fine." He nodded, looking at the screens. The feed was cycling through Sub-A at that moment. The storage area with its metal shelving and cardboard boxes. They took it out of our rotation. Dale nodded again, slowly. He was looking at the screens, but not really seeing them. His hand was resting on the back of Sandra's chair, and his thumb was tapping against the fabric in a small, absent rhythm. "Dale," I said. When you trained me, you said Sub D was decommissioned. That there's nothing down there. Have you ever been to Sub D? His thumb stopped tapping. He looked at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, his face had an expression I couldn't easily read. Not fear, exactly. Not discomfort. Something more like the careful blankness of someone who's decided not to think about something and has mostly succeeded. Once, he said. Years ago, before they sealed it, they wanted the cameras pulled and I went down with the tech to help. He paused. There's nothing down there, Marcus. Just empty rooms. What kind of empty? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the kind where you don't want to stay long. He picked up his keys from the desk. Anyway, I'll let you get to it. I listened to his footsteps in the hallway, quick, purposeful steps, the kind people take when they want to be somewhere else. The elevator chimed. The kind where you don't want to stay long. I turned that phrase over and over in my mind that night, the way you turn a stone in your pocket. It wasn't an explanation. It wasn't even a description, really. It was a feeling, the acknowledgement of a feeling, and it told me nothing and everything. The vibrations continued. Every night now, between 2 and 2:30, lasting several minutes. That low, rhythmic pulse. I stopped trying to identify it. I stopped trying to explain it. I just sat at my desk and felt it in my hands and feet and chest, and I waited for it to stop. And it always stopped, and I went on with my shift. But there was something else happening that I didn't notice immediately because it happened so gradually. The 6 gray screens in the rotation, the ones that said, feed inactive not in rotation, were no longer entirely gray. I noticed it first on B Alpha S slot. The screen was still showing the inactive message, but behind the text, barely visible, there was something other than uniform gray. A slight variation in the background. Darker in some areas than others. Like looking at a wall through very heavy fog, you couldn't make out shapes, but you could sense that something was there, interrupting the blankness. I leaned close to the screen. I adjusted the monitor brightness. The variation was subtle, almost below the threshold of perception, but it was there. Not static, not interference, not a technical artifact I recognized. More like the gray was deepening in certain areas, developing, the way a photograph develops in chemical solution. Slowly resolving from nothing into something. Over the next week, it got clearer. Not dramatically, not enough that anyone glancing at the screens would notice, but I was watching carefully. And night by night, the gray behind the text was taking on definition. Areas of light and dark that seemed to correspond to physical space, but not quite. The proportions were wrong, or the angle was wrong, or something about the geometry of what I was seeing didn't match what I remembered from when the camera was active. The corridor seemed longer. The walls seemed closer together. The perspective seemed to converge toward a vanishing point that was too close, as if the space itself had compressed. Wide. Wand and... I didn't log any of this. Intrusive way, most people is in prast. Not in de chassis. Why I say. Not in nigh. Why I say. I didn't tell some. I didn't email Greg. What would I say? The inactive screens are becoming slightly less gray? That's not a meme. That's not a facility issue. That's barely even an observation. It could be a display calibration issue. It could be phosphor degradation in the monitors. It could be my own eyes straining to find signal in noise after months of watching nothing. But I couldn't stop looking. Every night I studied those 6 screens during their 40-second appearances in the rotation, trying to see what was emerging from the gray. And every night it was slightly more defined. Slightly more there. By early February, I could see hallways. But when ass. But when was. When was. By dark hallways much darker than the ones I remembered from the active feeds. No overhead lighting. No just corridors stretching away into thick granular darkness, like the cameras were somehow seeing without any light source at all. And the hallways were wrong. They were too long. They had too many doors. The walls had details on them that I'd never seen before. Not signs or fixtures, but textures, patterns that might have been water damage or might have been something else. Something that crept along the surfaces in slow, branching lines like veins in stone. I told myself I was seeing things. I told myself it was apophenia, finding patterns and meaning in random visual noise. Mycessive wens and dash, mycessive way, aphenia, undi. The screens were inactive. They weren't receiving signal. Any variation in their display was a hardware issue, a monitor issue, not a real image of a real place. But then one night in mid-February, I saw movement. The south hallway, or what had been the south hallway, though it looked nothing like it now in these shadow images, stretched and warped and deep. Something at the far end of the hallway moved. Slowly. A shift in the darkness, a rearrangement of the deeper blacks within the already dark corridor. Like something large was occupying space down there and adjusting its position. Like something had turned its attention. I pushed back from the desk. Why? My chair rolled until it hit the wall behind me. I sat there, 3 feet from the screens, breathing too fast, watching the feed cycle away from B Delta to one of the Suba cameras, and then eventually cycle back 40 seconds of Sub A, 40 seconds of Sub C, 40 seconds of upper floors, and then B Alpha gray not gray screen, and then BI Bravo, and then I stood up and left the monitoring room. I walked down the hall to the bathroom, and I stood at the sink and ran cold water over my hands, and I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked tired. Dark circles. Dry lips. My eyes were bloodshot in a way that made them seem not quite mine. I was losing perspective. I knew that. I was spending too many hours in a dark room staring at screens, building narratives out of nothing, scaring myself with my own pattern recognition. This was a known psychological phenomenon. Night shift workers in monitoring roles were susceptible to it. Dale had probably mentioned something about it during training. Something about taking breaks, keeping the lights at a certain level, not fixating on any single feed for too long. I went back to the monitoring room. What? One-pactoring room. One made a do. I turned on the overhead lights, which I usually kept off because the screens were easier to see in the dark. The fluorescent tubes buzzed and flickered to life, flooding the room with flat white light. The screens dimmed in compensation. I couldn't see the variations in the gray anymore. Everything looked normal. Boring. I left the lights on for the rest of the shift. The next night I turned the lights off at 1 a.m. Just for a moment. Just to check. The gray screens resolved into their shadow images immediately. The dark hallways, the wrong proportions, the branching textures on the walls. I turned the lights back on. The images vanished into gray. It's the monitor brightness, I told myself. When the room is dark and your eyes are adjusted, you're seeing normal display variation amplified by your dark adapted vision and your own expectation. It's a known phenomenon. It's nothing. I kept the lights on after that. For 3 weeks I kept them on, and I didn't look at the sub-B screens, and I focused on my job, and I didn't think about the vibrations at 2 in the morning which were still happening, which I could still feel in the floor and the desk and the walls, which seemed to be getting stronger. In early March, my building badge stopped working at the elevator. Not completely. It still let me access the upper floors in the monitoring room. But when I stood at the elevator panel and swiped for SA or SC, which I sometimes did to grab supplies from Sub-AS storage room, the reader blinked red. Access denied. For 2 floors I'd been able to access since my first week. I reported it to Sandra, who said she'd ask about it. The next day she told me Greg said it was a system update, and they'd reissue my credentials. They never did. I asked twice more and then stopped asking, because Sandra's answers kept getting shorter and her eye contact kept getting briefer, and there was something in the quality of her silence that felt deliberate. I want to say something about the silence. Not the absence of sound. The building was never truly silent. There was always the HVAC, the fluorescent hum, the subtle creaking of a large structure settling against the earth. What I mean is the institutional silence. The silence of no one talking about it. No acknowledgement from anyone that anything was unusual. 6 cameras go dark in alphabetical order over the course of a month. Facilities finds nothing wrong, the floor is removed from monitoring, my access is restricted, and the official position is that everything is normal, that there's nothing to discuss. That silence was worse than the dark hallways on the screens, worse than the vibrations. Because the vibrations and the images, those might be in my head. Those might be fatigue and fixation and a lonely man scaring himself in an empty building at 3 in the morning. But the institutional silence was real. The emails from Greg, the notes from Sandra. Dale's careful blankness. Those were real choices made by real people who knew something they weren't saying. Or didn't they? Was I reading into that too? Were they just bored? Going through the motions of a corporate job where camera maintenance wasn't anyone's priority, was I assigning sinister intent to what was actually just bureaucratic apathy? I didn't know anymore. I couldn't tell the difference between a conspiracy of silence and the ordinary silence of people who don't care about your problems. Wellings sacked 5 by Wellings die. And that uncertainty, that inability to distinguish between the paranoid interpretation and the rational one, was perhaps the worst part of all of it. In late March, I came in for my shift and found that the monitoring software had been updated. The interface looked slightly different. New font, reorganized menu, and the sub-B screens were gone. And not gray, not inactive, just absent from the rotation entirely. The system now cycled through Sub-A, Sub-C, and the upper floors only. As if Sub-B had never been part of the building. As if those 6 cameras had never existed. I checked the system settings. I navigated to the camera configuration panel. Sub-B was listed, but the entries for each camera B... Alpha through B Foxtrot were grayed out with a status I'd never seen before. Not offline, not inactive, not failed. Archived, like they'd been filed away. Put into storage. Kept but not accessed. I clicked on B Foxtrot. The last one to go dark, the archive room camera. The configuration panel showed standard information: model number, installation date, network address. But there was a new field at the bottom I hadn't seen before. Last verified image capture. And next to it, a timestamp. The timestamp was from that morning, 6:47 a.m., hours before my shift. While I was at home, sleeping, the camera was capturing images. It was seeing something. But the feed wasn't being displayed. It was being archived, stored somewhere I couldn't access. I stared at that timestamp for a long time. Then I closed the configuration panel and went about my shift as if I hadn't seen it. What else could I do? Who would I tell? What would I say? My supervisor told me to stop asking questions. My credentials were restricted. The system was updated without my input. I was a night shift monitor making $23 an hour because I needed dental insurance. I was not a security expert. I was not an investigator. I was a man in a room watching screens, and the screens had been taken away from me, and the thing I was supposed to be watching was still there beneath my feet, in the dark, doing whatever it was doing without my observation. I'm going to talk about April. The vibration stopped. Abruptly, completely, without explanation. One night they were there, that low pulse at 2 in the morning, and the next night they weren't. And the night after that, nothing. And the night after that. The building was quiet, in a way. It hadn't been in months. A different kind of quiet. More like the quiet of something that's finished. I noticed around this time that I had stopped sleeping almost entirely. Not insomnia in the dramatic sense. I could close my eyes, I could lie in bed, I could drift in and out of something that resembled rest. But true sleep, deep sleep, the kind where time passes and you don't know it that had left me. I'd lie in bed for 6 or 7 hours and then get up feeling exactly as tired as when I'd laid down. My days had a flat, cottony quality to them. The light through my apartment windows seemed thinner than it should have been. I went to not the dentist I'd gotten the root canal back in January, now that my insurance was active. No, I went to my primary care physician and told him I wasn't sleeping well. He asked about stress, about changes in routine, about caffeine and screen time. I told him I worked nights. He nodded, like that explained everything, and prescribed me melatonin and told me to try blackout curtains. I didn't tell him about the building. I didn't tell him about Sub B, I-teen. What would I say? That I'd been watching screens go dark, one by one. That I'd felt vibrations in the floor. That I'd seen or thought I'd seen shadow images in inactive displays. He'd refer me to a psychiatrist. And maybe that's what I needed. Maybe that's what I should have done. But there was a part of me quiet, stubborn, certain in a way I couldn't justify that knew I wasn't imagining it. That the cameras went dark in alphabetical order. That the intervals were 4 days. That facilities found nothing wrong. That the institution closed ranks and stopped looking. These were facts. Whatever they meant, they were real events that happened in a real building, documented in a real maintenance log system. The melatonin didn't help. In mid-April, 2 things happened on the same night. At 2:15 a.m., the elevator on the first floor activated by itself. I know this because I heard it, the soft chime, the hum of the motor engaging. I was on the second floor in the monitoring room, and the elevator shaft ran through the core of the building, and the sound carried through the walls. I heard it descend. not to Sub-A, not to Sub-C. It went down past those floors. I could tell by the duration of the motor running, by the pitch of the cable system as it paid out. It went further down than it should have been able to go. Then it stopped. And after a moment, it came back up. Back to the first floor. The chime sounded again. Then silence. I pulled up the elevator log in the monitoring software. The system showed no activity. No trips recorded. No badge swipes. As if it hadn't moved at all. The second thing that happened. I found a door open on the second floor. Not the monitoring room door. A different door further down the hall, past the bathrooms, in a section of the floor I rarely visited because it was just empty offices left over from some previous departmental configuration. I noticed it during my... A door that was usually closed was now open about 3 inches. I stood in front of it.
I didn't open it further. I didn't look inside.
I just stood there, in the fluorescent lit hallway, looking at the 3-inch gap of darkness, and I thought, this door was closed when I walked past at midnight.
I'm sure of it.
I reached out and pulled it closed.
Latch clicked.
I stood there for another moment, then continued my walk. Back in the monitoring room, I checked the camera feed for that hallway. The second floor corridor camera should have shown the door. I scrubbed back through the footage to the time when it might have opened. Now. When. Now. Whence
Damn! I noticed it during my 3 a.m.
perimeter walk. Then there was a gap, a 17-minute gap, where the recording simply jumped. One timestamp read 2:08 a.m., and the next read 2:25 a.m. No error message, no signal loss, no indication of interruption. The footage just skipped, as if those 17 minutes had never existed. I checked the other cameras for similar gaps. Sub-A, Sub-C, upper floors. All of them had the same 17-minute gap.
Knock! Simultaneous. And perimeter walk. Walk.
I wrote a detailed email to Greg with timestamps and screenshots.
I see,
said Sandra. I used the subject line, recording gap, all cameras 020802225. Thank you for the report. This appears to be a software issue related to the recent system update. IT has been notified.
E.T. I noticed it during my 3 a.m. perimeter walk.
A different department. A different excuse. A different deflection.
Nothing would be done. I only would be explained.
After that night, I started keeping a personal log. A notebook I brought from home, not the same one I'd used before. A new one.
I noticed it during my 3 a.m. perimeter walk. Walk.
What I heard, what I felt, what was open that should have been closed, and what was closed that should have been open. I wrote it in small, careful handwriting, and I kept it in my bag, and I didn't leave it at the monitoring station.
Knock!
April 18th. Elevator activated 2:15 a.m. No log entry. Recording gap 2.08 to 2.25. All cameras. Door open in east hallway, second floor. No explanation provided. April 19th. No incidents. Quiet shift. But the building feels different. Can't specify how. The quality of the silence has changed. They in perimeter walk. April 20th. Sandra called in sick. First time since I started. Worked alone all day and tonight, covering partial overlap. Building emptied early, last employee badge off at 4:47 p.m., 2 hours before normal.
During my 3 a.m. perimeter walk.
April 22nd. 3 lights in the first floor lobby are out. Not flickering fully out. Asked facilities via email. Greg responded. Bulbs on order. Same 3 lights have been on continuously for 5 months without issue.
I noticed it during my 3 a.m. perimeter walk.
April 24th. Elevator activated at 2:11 a.m. Same descent. Same impossible depth. Same return. No log entry, no recording gap this time. The footage shows the elevator doors closed on the first floor, not opening. But I heard it move. I know I heard it.
The perimeter walk.
April 26th. Temperature in monitoring room noticeably lower than usual. Check thermostat reads normal 68 degrees Fahrenheit. But my hands are cold. My breath isn't visible, but it feels like it should be.
The perimeter walk.
April 28th. Foxtrot's timestamp and the camera config updated again. Checked at start of shift, last image capture 7:02 a.m. today. Camera is still taking pictures. Someone is still looking at them. Or something is still being shown.
I noticed it during my 3 a.m. perimeter walk.
I'd been at Kellerbrandt for 6 months. My root canal was healed. I noticed it during my 3 a.m. perimeter walk. I had no reason to stay except the paycheck and the inertia of having committed to something. And one other reason, which I recognized as unhealthy. I wanted to understand what was happening below me. Below the building. Below the concrete and the rebar and the waterproofing. And the dark. On a Tuesday in early May, I arrived for my shift, and Sandra was gone.
Not sick gone. Walk.
Her paperback, her thermos, her personal items all removed. The desk was clean, except for a sheet of paper with my name on it.
In Greg's handwriting.
Sandra has been reassigned to the day monitoring desk at our Oakmont location. Effective immediately, you will be covering full overnight monitoring solo until a replacement is hired. Please direct any questions to your direct supervisor.
The perimeter walk. Walk.
I left a message that was polite and professional and did not ask any of the questions I actually wanted to ask. He called back the next morning, the only time he ever returned my call, and said, briefly, that Sandra had requested the transfer and it had nothing to do with the Sub B situation.
What Sub B situation? I asked. Apples. Walk.
The camera situation, which has been resolved.
Walk.
The cameras have been decommissioned. The floor is being monitored through other means. It's not a concern for monitoring staff.
I am.
That's above your scope, Marcus. Is there anything else? Neither my 3 a.m. perimeter walk. Not that he'd tell me. I was alone now. The monitoring room was mine 12 screens. 1 occupant, 8 hours of silence. No handoffs.
Nye.
No Sandra walking in at 8 with her thermos and her quiet presence and her careful avoidance of the things we both knew were wrong. I want to describe what the building felt like in those weeks.
Lock.
Not just of people, of something else. Of some quality I can't name. Like a house after a funeral when everyone has gone home and the food is put away and the sympathy flowers are still on the counter, but the life is drained from everything.
Yeah.
The HVAC still cycled. The elevator still ran during business hours, carrying administrative staff to their desks and back. But underneath the normalcy, underneath the hum and the click and the routine, nothing. A void where something had been. Or where something was waiting to be. The vibrations had been gone for weeks. The elevator no longer activated at night.
Nah.
No doors were open. That shouldn't have been. Everything was, by all measurable criteria, normal.
I noticed it during my 3 a.m. perimeter walk. Walk. I noticed it during my 3 a.m. perimeter walk.
The building was operating as designed. Why? And yet I sat at my desk every night feeling like I was perched on the surface of deep water. Like the floor was a membrane, thin and taut, and beneath it was a depth I couldn't fathom. I felt watched not by cameras or people or anything with eyes, but by attention. Like the building itself was aware of me in the way that water is aware of a boat.
Hawk! Not hit during my 3 a.m. perimeter walk.
Without interest, but without indifference either.
I noticed it during my 3 a.m. perimeter walk.
In mid-May, I finally did the thing I'd been thinking about for months.
Done on my 3 a.m. perimeter walk.
My badge didn't work on the elevator. But there was a stairwell. A fire exit stairwell on the north side of the building that I could access from the first floor. It went down to Sub AA, only the door to Sub Bay's landing was clearly marked with a badge reader and a red sign that said, "Restricted access, authorized personnel only." But Sub Bay's door opened with a push bar.
I noticed it during my 3 a.m. walk.
Sub AA was exactly what it should have been.
Walk!
Metal shelving units loaded with boxes of printer paper and old office chairs stacked 4 high and filing cabinets labeled by year and Christmas decorations in labeled bins. The overhead lights were motion activated. They flicked on as I moved through the space, one section at a time, giving me a moving bubble of light in the surrounding dark. It smelled like dust and cardboard. The floor was painted concrete gray, slightly uneven, with drain grates at regular intervals. The ceiling was low, maybe 8 feet, with exposed pipes and conduit running in neat parallel lines toward the mechanical core of the building. I walked the length of the floor. It took about 4 minutes at a normal pace. The space was divided into sections by the shelving units, creating aisles that all ran east-west. At the far western end, against the wall, I found what I was looking for.
Not a rat's the floor.
Or rather, what was beneath the floor.
Noticed it during my 3 a.m. perimeter walk.
The concrete under my feet was the ceiling of Sub B's corridors and rooms. I stood there, in the dim space between shelving units full of old binders and broken monitors and boxes of envelopes, and I looked down at the gray-painted concrete and I thought about what was below it. I crouched down and pressed my palm flat against the floor. Cold. Colder than it should have been in a climate-controlled building. The kind of cold that doesn't come from air temperature, the kind that comes from mass. Why? From depth. From something large and cold beneath a thin surface. I pressed my ear to the floor. I don't know what I expected to hear. The building's mechanical heartbeat, the hum of the climate control units on Sub B. But the distant groan of the elevator shaft. What I heard was nothing. A total, absolute nothing. Not silence. Silence is the absence of sound, and you can perceive it as such. Now, not silence, one wine man rim, all and 9 rim, mad and teen, then how's that sidin'? Not This was something else. Like pressing your ear to a void and hearing the void press back. Overate. This has happened, you Dak. Overate. And quote, Why? An active nothing that seemed to push against my eardrum the way deep water pushes against a diver. I pulled my head up fast. Too fast, I knocked my forehead against the edge of a shelving unit and sat back on the cold floor with stars in my vision and a thin trickle of blood running into my eyebrow. I sat there for a minute, catching my breath, pressing my sleeve against the cut. The motion lights had turned off around me. I was sitting in the dark. I waved my hand and the nearest one clicked back on, flooding the aisle with flat, white light. I got up and left. Back up the stairs, back to the first floor. Back up the elevator to the monitoring room. I cleaned the cut with paper towels from the bathroom. It was small. It stopped bleeding quickly. I sat back down at my desk and looked at the screens cycling through their feeds, and I thought, Ooh. They... I am not going back down there. And then I someone is, though. The cameras are still taking pictures. Greg said the floor is being monitored through other means. Someone or something is observing Sub B, and it isn't me, and they aren't telling me what they see. Last week, 5 days ago, I found something on my desk at the start of my shift. A photograph, printed on standard office paper, in color, placed face down next to my keyboard. No note. No indication of who left it or when. I turned it over. It was the archive room. Sub B. The Foxtrot camera's view, I recognized the angle immediately, the high corner looking down across the rows of shelving. But the image was wrong. The lighting was wrong. The room in the photograph wasn't lit by the even clinical overhead lights I remembered. It was lit by something else, something that seemed to come from below, from the floor itself, a faint luminescence that cast long shadows upward across the shelving and made the ceiling disappear into darkness. And the shelving was different, not rearranged or transformed. The metal units were still there, still in their rows, but they seemed taller. Extending up beyond the frame of the image, beyond what should have been possible in a room with an 8-foot ceiling, captured. The boxes on the shelves were no longer white-labeled pharmaceutical archives. Treg, Vi. They were dark. Featureless. Uniform in size, but somehow each one slightly different from the next, as if they'd grown organically rather than been manufactured. And at the far end of the center aisle, in the space between the shelves where I'd once seen a dark shape on the floor, there was something standing. One. I use the word standing loosely. It was vertical. It was tall, much taller than a person. It was narrow and dark, and it was facing the camera. I couldn't make out features. There were no features to make out. It was a long, vertical shape, and it was there, in the archive room, in the photograph taken by a camera that was supposed to be decommissioned, printed on a piece of paper that someone had placed on my desk. I put the photograph in my bag. I sat at my desk. I didn't look at it again that night. Where? Why? 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 I finished my shift. I went home. I didn't sleep. The next night, there was another photograph. Same printer paper. Same placement face down, next to the keyboard. This one showed the corridor, the south hallway, the Delta camera's view. Unquote. Unquote. Unquota. When... The hallway was dark, lit by that same faint underglow, and it was long. Far too long. It extended into a distance that the actual Sub-B hallway couldn't contain 100 meters, maybe more, straight and unwavering, narrowing to a vanishing point where the darkness was total. And in the hallway, along the left wall, the doors were open. All of them. Every door I could see in the image stood open, and through each doorway was a darkness deeper than the hallway itself, a concentrated dark that seemed to spill outward like liquid, pooling at the threshold of each door. I put this photograph in my bag, too. Third night. Another photograph. B Alpha? View. The elevator vestibule. The elevator doors were open. Inside the elevator car, looking in from the camera's angle, I could see the panel. The buttons. But there were more buttons than there should have been. Below SC, below where the panel should have ended, there were more. 5 more. I couldn't count them precisely because the image quality degraded toward the bottom of the frame, but there were buttons going down to levels that don't exist in the building's plans. Levels below sub D, levels below everything. The elevator car itself was lit. The fluorescent panel in its ceiling was on, but Comet D, our was on. Ta with side A. Wow. Then suddenly I was the guy. Side A. The Specin panel in its side. And in that light I could see that the walls of the car were wrong. They weren't stainless steel anymore. They were something else. Something that had a texture like wood, grain, or, no, capiting, rye, Y-Y-I. Like growth rings, like cross-sections of something that had accumulated over time. Right? I took this photograph too. 3 in my bag now. 3 images of a place that didn't match any reality I could verify. Oh, cappened. I coppened. Now, 3 records of something impossible, left for me by someone who had access to the building during the day, who had access to a printer, who had access to whatever system was still capturing these images from Sub B's cameras. Was it a warning? A provocation? Was someone trying to scare May, or trying to show me something they couldn't say aloud? Was it Dale? Sandra? Someone from facilities I'd never met? Was it Greg himself performing institutional silence in his emails while leaving evidence on my desk in the dark hours? But D... I don't know. I haven't received another photograph since that 3rd one. 3 nights, 3 images, then nothing. Like the cameras themselves, a pattern that begins and then simply stops, without explanation, without resolution. I-resolution. I-res. I still have the photographs. They're in my apartment, in a drawer, under a stack of utility bills. I don't look at them often. When I do, they look like what they are. What? Why? Color prints on office paper, slightly grainy, slightly overexposed in the bright areas. There. Duh. Real, in the way that a physical object in your hands is real, undeniably, regardless of what it depicts. On den your dept, I felmais and rounds, towns and rounds and rounds, in the nighs and rounds, tack, towns and maybe a pies and rounds, in dens and rounds, something bounds and rounds, they fiving rounds and rounds, they're gaving rounds and last night was my shift. Tonight will be my shift. Tomorrow night will be my shift. My Lex day. I'll go to the building and I'll sit in the monitoring room and I'll watch the feeds cycle through the floors they still show me, and I'll feel the cold coming up through the floor, and I'll listen to the silence that's replaced the vibrations, and I'll check whether there's a photograph on my desk, and mostly there won't be, and I'll drink bad coffee, and I'll read my book, and I'll try not to think about what's below me. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. I cly. Well... where? But it's... my path. The thing that won't let me go. My. The 6 cameras went dark in alphabetical order. Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo, Foxtrot, and then they were archived. And then they started capturing images again of something that shouldn't be there. And the system is working. The cameras are working. They're seeing something. They're recording it. Someone set them to archive mode instead of display mode, which means someone made a conscious decision that these images should be captured but not watched. Should be stored but not seen. Should exist but not be acknowledged. Why would you keep a camera running if you didn't want anyone to see what it showed? Unless you weren't keeping it running for observation. Unless you were keeping it running for something else. Unless the cameras weren't watching Sub B at all. My Y pile. Oh. B. Unless something in Sub B was watching the cameras. Unless the feed was going the other direction, not recording what was down there, but showing what was up here. Showing it the building. The hallways. The people showing it to me. I think about that when I'm sitting at my desk at 3 a.m. I think about 6 cameras pointed at the dark, and the dark looking back through them like windows. I think about archived images that no one is supposed to see unless the seeing is the point. Unless being seen is the point. Unless every time I checked those feeds, every time I pinned a camera and watched and stared and leaned close to the screen, I was not observing. I was being observed. And I think about the photographs on my desk. 3 images of impossible spaces left for me to find. Left for me to look at. Left for me to see. And I wonder what saw me back. I still go to work every night. Why? Why? I still need the insurance. That hasn't changed. The building hasn't changed, not visibly. Not in any way I could explain to another person. It's still 5 stories of tinted glass and beige concrete in an office park in Braddock. The parking lot is still lit by sodium lights. The HVAC still cycles. The elevator still runs. People still come in during the day and sit at their desks and do their jobs and leave at 5 or 6 and drive home to their families. And below all of it, below the lobby and the offices and the storage and the corridors and the climate-controlled archive room with its rows of dark boxes on shelves that go up too high, there are levels that shouldn't exist. And something in them is patient and attentive, and it has been watching for longer than I've been there. Why? Longer than I go to work tonight. If there's a photograph on my desk, I'll put it in my bag. Nai. My Jaisuke. If there's not, I'll sit in the quiet and I'll watch the screens that show me nothing important. And I'll feel the floor under my feet and I'll try not to think about what's beneath it. But I'll think about it anyway. You'd think about it too.